Okay, we're back with another question in our series on apologetics, and this week we're going to be looking at the historical evidence for the person of Jesus. I think it's important that we think about the evidence for Jesus' life and the things that he did, because first of all it can encourage us in our faith, and also it can help us to share and to defend the quite drastic claims that we believe that Jesus was and is the Son of God. So there are two questions to consider. Firstly, did Jesus really exist? So I've got this thing where I'm going to try and write the questions. Did Jesus... Oh, this isn't working. Yeah. Firstly, did Jesus really exist? And then afterwards we're going to look at the question, well, if he did really exist, then who was he, and was his claim to be the Son of God true, or was it false? So firstly, let's look at that first question then. Did Jesus really exist? So if you ask people today who they think Jesus was, you might get a lot of different reactions and responses. Some people might say he was a good moral teacher and a good example, and you may even find some people who claim that he never really existed at all, but he's a myth or a legend that formed over hundreds of years by people who just made him into the Son of God. But normally the formation of a cultural myth or a legend would take many centuries to happen, over lots of different generations. But in fact the New Testament, according to the historian W.F. Albright, he was convinced that it was written between the years 50 and 75 AD, in which case it was written only within 20 years of the events that it describes. So we can't say that the Gospels were just cultural myths that happened over a long time, and they were therefore based on historical events. Mark was the earliest Gospel to be written, around 50 AD, which is only 20 years after the events took place. Now we might say that 20 years is a long time to remember details. I don't know if you can remember where you were 20 years ago, or what you had for breakfast then, but the events described in the Gospels happened in public, and they were not behind closed doors. They were also major events that happened. If you had witnessed the feeding of the 5,000, or Jesus healing the sick, or raising the dead, including seeing Jesus himself raised from the dead, you're not likely to forget it, even in 20 years. And therefore, if somebody reported a major event today, and it didn't really happen, then you would expect someone to contradict it, or deny that the events happened. If someone today claimed that a major historical event happened in the year 2000, and they were wrong, then someone who remembers what actually happened 20 years ago would challenge that, and they would say that it didn't really happen. And the same would have happened, surely, in the 1st century AD. But we have no evidence at all that anyone at that time claimed that the message of the Gospels, or the events that they accounted, were not true. In fact, the evidence that we have from the other sources outside the Bible actually confirms that the history revealed by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were accurate. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus, let me try and write that, Josephus, he was a Jewish historian, and he said, there's this quote from him: "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." So that was in his book 18 of the Antiquities of the Jews. We also have other examples, like the Roman historian Tacitus, write his name, and Tacitus wrote the Annals and Histories of the Roman Emperors. And there's a quote from him here. Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So not only does this confirm that Jesus existed, but also that the historical events described in the Gospels, like the character of Pontius Pilate, were real people and these things really happened. So these sources are from people who are not Christians, and they help us to confirm that the Gospels are accurate in the historical information they record, as well as the fact that we have 5,856 Greek manuscripts from the original New Testament, and that tells us that the New Testament that we read today is essentially the same as the one that was written in the first century. So we can be confident that the answer to the question, did Jesus really exist? We can be confident that the answer to that question is, yes, he did. So then, we've looked at the evidence that Jesus really existed, and we've confirmed that he did. And the evidence also shows that he claimed to be the Son of God, since this was the reason why he was arrested and why he was crucified, because the Jews believe in only one God. And at the time, anyone who claimed to be equal with God or to be God was committing blasphemy, and they deserved to be punished by death, and that's why they crucified him. In Matthew chapter 16, and verses 16 to 17, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replies, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So clearly there we see that Jesus must have been more than just a moral teacher. He claimed to be the Son of God. So such a serious claim like that, we can't just ignore it. C.S. Lewis says this in a radio interview. I'll just get the quote here. Page 28. He says this in a radio interview. "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I am ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse." And Lewis adds, "You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to." So when we are faced with Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, we have two options. Either that claim was true, or the claim was false. I'll just write that down. That didn't work. Right. So when we look at the idea that Jesus' claim to be the Son of God was not true, we have a further two options. Either he was not telling the truth and he knew that he wasn't telling the truth, or the other option is that he wasn't telling the truth, but he was mistaken. He believed that he was the Son of God, but he wasn't, and he was mistaken. So in that case, he didn't know that he was not telling the truth. So let's first consider that first option, that effectively Jesus was lying. If he was making a false claim, and he was doing it deliberately to deceive people into believing him, that would make Jesus a liar. And if this was the case, then he must also have been a hypocrite, because he taught his followers to be honest. He would also be an evil man and not a good moral teacher, since he told others to trust him for their eternal destiny, and that he is the only source of forgiveness. He would also be a fool, because his claim to be God ultimately led to his crucifixion. So we have to ask the question as well whether so much positive impact on the world could have come from somebody who was lying. And that, as well as the fact that if you were going to try and convince a group of people to believe you were the Son of God, you probably wouldn't choose to become a carpenter. And you probably wouldn't choose to speak to first century Jews who considered it blasphemy to claim to be God, whereas maybe the Greeks or the Romans may have more easily accepted it. So I think we can rule out that option, that Jesus could have been lying and known that he was not telling the truth. So the other possibility then is that Jesus believed he was the Son of God, but he was just mistaken. If this is the case, then C.S. Lewis would have been right when he said that this man would be on the same level as one who claims to be a poached egg. Even back then, this kind of person would have been locked away to prevent themselves from hurting themselves or anyone else. This kind of person would be a lunatic. I'm sure there are people today who make those kinds of claims, but they live in caves and they eat grass. But when we look at the life and ministry of Jesus, we find that he doesn't show any kind of imbalance or disorder. He seems to be completely sound mentally, and his teaching is profound. There's a psychiatrist called J.T. Fisher who says this. It's quoted in this book by Josh McDowell. If I can find it. 35. If you were to take the sum total of all authoritative articles ever written by the most qualified of psychologists and psychiatrists on the subject of mental hygiene, if you combine all the unadulterated bits of pure scientific knowledge concisely expressed by the most capable of living poets, you would have an awkward and incomplete summation of the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preached in Matthew chapter 5 to 7. So clearly we see that somebody who's had such a positive impact on the world and who preached such profound teaching cannot possibly have been a lunatic. So we are therefore left with only one option, that Jesus was and is exactly who he claimed to be. He is the Son of God. And if that's the case, if you don't yet believe in him, that claim, if it is true, requires a response. Such an important message cannot be ignored. And as Jesus said we must do, we must repent and turn away from our sin and believe and trust in Jesus for our salvation. And if you do believe in him, you can be encouraged that your belief is not just a blind faith or a false hope, but it is truth based on facts and reality. So that's all I have to say on the historical evidence for Jesus. Hopefully we can discuss these things a bit further.